Okay. Okay, and we are live. So everyone, welcome to Nerd Church on this third Sunday of Advent. Once again, I am Katie. I have a bachelor's degree in religious studies, and I have also done a great deal of study on my own, mostly focusing on um, early church history as well as the development of Catholic thought um, through the Middle Ages to the present day. I suppose this is my week to give a little bit of my Catholic background. I was raised Catholic, sort of left the church for a variety of reasons in my late teens. Got involved in the wild and wacky world of modern neo paganism for about 10 years. And then left that, and then gradually found myself drifting back towards the Catholic Church. And I've been actively practicing again for a couple of years now. Um, and part of my journey in coming back to the Catholic Church was realizing that because of the way that Catholics read the Bible, the fact that we are willing, the fact that the Catholic Church as an institution has historically been willing to engage with critical scholarship and has very clear logic that's laid out even for the more supernatural beliefs. I found out that what I was learning in as I got more interested in studying church history and studying the New Testament was that my faith in the Catholic Church was being reinforced rather than torn down. And that was really, for me, sort of the core of wanting to start this channel, was to kind of show people how, from a religious standpoint, as well as from a critical scholarship standpoint, that really one can reinforce the other, and to sort of demonstrate that no, critical scholarship isn't about making atheists, and at the same time that that practicing a religious faith doesn't mean turning your brain off. So that's kind of why we are here. And Aldo is the master of Hebrew and Aramaic and has done and can introduce himself better than I can.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, I think you touched on a couple of very interesting points. I guess we all pass through this stage in our lives where when we're teens, we start to question everything about life, including religion, of course. And for me, it was pretty straightforward. So I just read the New Testament, I just flipped through the pages and I quickly arrived to the conclusion that, okay, Jesus wants us to follow the law. Jesus wants us to follow some sort of Judaism. Case closed. That was it. So from then on, I started studying the Hebrew Bible. I taught myself Hebrew and Aramaic. and that led me into the world of the ancient translations of the Bible, the Targumim, which we have been using during our last live streams, rabbinic literature, and as you said, I have found it really interesting and very important to engage with the texts. So the more we know about the texts, and that is not just having memorized, committed to memory any particular translation you're using, but going back to the actual original languages is very useful for you to understand what the authors really meant. And if you pair that with studying the actual historical and cultural context, then you will have a richer interpretation of what the New Testament, what the New Testament's message is for all of us. But yeah, I do believe we are better off trying to gather as much information, trying to go as deep as possible, because in the end, if you're a practicing Christian, don't you think Jesus would be more than proud of you if he noticed you pondered the scriptures as much as possible, including the actual scholarship as well as the traditional doctrines or beliefs of your community?
Yes, absolutely. And along those lines, why don't we get started? Before I start with the readings, I do want to mention just briefly that this third Sunday in Advent is traditionally called Gaudete Sunday, which is taken from the Latin imperative that just means rejoice. And so we're going to notice and this is reflected in the readings, you'll notice that they have sort of a much more kind of upbeat tone. So we're talking and are focused specifically on Jesus's messiahship, and rather than, sort of, we're waiting for Jesus, we're waiting for Jesus, we're waiting for the second coming. Another thing that should be mentioned, just a note as far as historical practice goes, up until fairly recently, really, like, and when I say recently, as often happens, I'm talking about post-Vatican II. Advent really was a season of fasting and abstinence that was sort of a parallel to Lent, so that you were, well, actually during the Middle Ages you were basically going vegan, or at least vegetarian for the winter, for the 40 days for the 4 weeks of Advent. And the one exception to that was that third Sunday, which was, you basically, the fasting rules were put on hold for one day. So you kind of got one day, yes, we're going to be really happy. And that's why the liturgical color is pink. So if you start Googling Pope Leo third Sunday, you'll get all kinds of really entertaining pictures of the Pope in a pink dress. If you want to see some really high quality ecclesiastical embroidery. And I should mention also, for one way that's carried over, particularly in the Italian American community in the United States, is there's a custom to have the dinner of the 7 fishes on Christmas Eve, where you have 7 different kinds of seafood. And that's a holdover from the old days when it was a fast day, so you had to have fish. And of course now it's, when seafood is seen as more of a luxury, it's now it's a celebratory thing. Okay, So, all that said, let's get down to the readings. All right. So, our first reading is Isaiah 30, chapter 35, verse 1 through 6, and then verse 10. So, the desert and the parched land will exult, the steppe will rejoice and bloom. They will bloom with abundant flowers and rejoice with joyful song. The glory of Lebanon will be given to them, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the hands that are feeble, make firm the knees that are weak. Say to those whose hearts are frightened, be strong, fear not. Here is your God. He comes with vindication. With divine recompense, he comes to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, the ears of the deaf be cleared. Then will the lame leap like a stag. Then the tongue of the mute will sing. Those whom the Lord has ransomed will return and enter Zion singing, crowned with everlasting joy. They will meet with joy and gladness, sorrow and mourning will flee. And then the responsorial psalm is Psalm 146, and specifically 6 through 10. So the response for this, as if you were hearing this in church, would be, Lord, come and save us. Which, again, I will not insist that Aldo give the responses. The Lord God keeps faith forever, secures justice for the oppressed, gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets captives free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord raises up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the just. The Lord protects strangers. The fatherless and the widow he sustains, but the way of the wicked he thwarts. The Lord shall reign forever, your God, O Zion, through all generations. And then we have the second reading, which is James chapter 5, verse 7 through 10. This is an epistle, but we're getting a little bit of a break from Paul, and we're moving on to St. James. Be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient with it, until it receives the early and late rains. You too must be patient. Make your hearts firm, because the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not complain, brothers and sisters, about one another, that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing before the gates. Take as an example of hardship and patience, brothers and sisters, the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And then the final reading is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 2 through 11. When John the Baptist heard in prison the works of the Christ, he sent his disciples to Jesus with this question: Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? Jesus said to them in reply, Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind regain their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the good news proclaimed to them. And blessed is the one who takes no offense at me. As they were going off, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. What did you go out to the desert to see? A reed swayed by the wind? Then what did you go out to see? Someone dressed in fine clothing? Those who wear fine clothing are in royal palaces. Then why did you go out? To see a prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, Behold, I am sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way before you. Amen, I say to you, among those born of women, there have been none greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Okay, so that's the readings. I I think we kind of had talked a little bit about how they all fit together. One thing that I wanted to highlight is that we have basically in the Gospel of Matthew, we have, Jesus is basically directly quote Isaiah. And we see this as part of the way that the early Jesus movement and the early Christian community were, again, very much interested in the project of putting these um, of putting these stories kind of directly in conversation with each other. And in Matthew, of course, it's a fairly, it it's such a simple argument that it's barely an argument. It's basically saying, okay, all of the stuff that is being predicted about the Messiah in Isaiah is happening right now with Jesus. Here's your checklist. And then as you go through Matthew, you see all the healings, and it's like, okay, yep, check, check, check. Must be the Messiah.
Correct.
And that I think is and then of course the section from James is also, hinting at we need to look at the prophets and we need to be thinking about things the way that the prophets thought about things as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to highlight about the readings and conversation. Aldo, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Sure. There's these recurring themes like, the rebirth shown through the, dry land blossoming and the desert regions becoming full of green again. God as a judge, people being patient and being patient just like if they were farmers waiting for the crops to grow. So yeah, it is beautifully put together, and I hope everyone is just becoming conscious of all the work behind these readings because they want to become a cohesive whole where these all these ideas are being drilled down to us so we can just get a richer understanding of the reading of the gospel, which is the central reading.
Yes. Okay. And did you have anything in particular that you wanted to discuss with Isaiah?
Mhm. So regarding Isaiah, the reading starts with all these let's say natural all these elements of nature, the wilderness, the desert, places like Lebanon, Carmel, and Sharon. But it is in Jewish literature, all these are personified and they are related to the people of Israel. And that is an interesting reading because in the end, when we go back to the Matthew reading, you will notice that there's this connection between the wilderness and John the Baptist. And it is actually the people who go to the desert to try to see something, to try to understand what is going on, and whether they are just there to watch a reed being shaken by the wind, or looking for someone dressed up in fine clothes, or even looking for a prophet. The same kind of thing sort of happens in Isaiah. And so this shows this thematic continuity between the book of Isaiah, which is really important for the Jews as well as for Christians. It is one of the most read books in the Bible, and we can see its influence all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then And of course, then this final part where it says, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For joy. Here, Jewish interpretation makes out of this blindness towards the law, deafness towards the word of God. But we can see in Matthew again that Jesus makes all this. It is no longer about the law, but about an actual physical healing of all those faculties. So that is the reason why Jesus says, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. So that's a change, a shift in the interpretation of the way they see these physical disabilities back in the times of Isaiah and more recently in the times of Jesus.
Yeah, and it's interesting that on the one hand, it's this part of Matthew is arguing for a very literal interpretation of Isaiah in terms of the miraculous aspects. But at the same time, it's like, okay, our evidence for Jesus being the Messiah is the physical healing miracles, and we're going to kind of then immediately have to pivot for a more figurative interpretation of what messiahship means.
Right.
Uh, and because immediately then we're talking about the kingdom of heaven. Um, and what that looks like. So it's kind of, I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. It's an interesting juxtaposition, and it really shows how much kind of thought and logic and kind of negotiating and massaging of the text is going on as these relationships are being constructed.
Exactly. I'm going to be honest with you. Whenever I go to church, which is like 2 or 3 times a year, uh, I usually miss all these connections. It isn't until I sit down and go through each of them that I find the connecting threads. But I guess I am not alone when I say that perhaps all of these connections go under the radar of most of the people when they are at church during Mass.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting because a lot of time, well, and I think that part of that is that when priests give their homilies, like I want to say, like at least in my experience, like maybe 90% of the time, they pretty much just preach on the gospel.
Mhm.
Um, I'm my parish is a little bit different because they actually will like talk about the themes, and sometimes we'll even be like, yeah, they just kind of gloss over the gospel, and it's like, okay, yeah, we're the Old Testament passage or the epistle is where the meat is really at, and we'll then get really into it. But certainly that's the exception rather than the rule. Uh,
Right. And on my end, it's usually about current events. So it is even more loosely, sometimes I think the father at the church may be just trying to force his interpretation into the readings, which isn't always successful. So I guess we're better off trying to, here at Nerd Church, trying to see how these readings converse with one another instead of just trying
yeah,
to link them to some current events.
yeah, exactly. And that's why, because I know that personally, I kind of sometimes find it frustrating
Mhm.
because it's like there's so much going on. Why aren't we talking about this?
Right.
Um, and I hope that, other people as they find the channel and find these recordings will find it to be an interesting prospect. Um, now, did you have anything you wanted to say about the Psalm?
So the Psalms, they repeat this all these topics, right? Like the Lord opens the eyes of the blind, which we also had a look at in Matthew as well as in Isaiah. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord watches over strangers. So here's again this theme about God being a provider as well as a judge for the people of Israel. And it is a nice bridge between the reading in Isaiah and Matthew.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
pretty much what I noticed about this
Yeah.
reading.
Okay. So then, moving on from that to the letter of James,
Mhm.
we've got kind of a lot going on here, um, because we have not one, but two elephants in the room.
Mhm.
And the first elephant in the room is, of course, the issue that this epistle traditionally um, is traditionally attributed to James, the brother of Jesus. Now, this can be a problem, and as we have said before, here on Nerd Church, we are not heresy friendly. So I am putting on my Catholic hat. This is also known as a mantilla or a chapel veil, depending on um, whether you are just borrowing the Spanish word into English or making up a new English word when mantilla is good enough. Um, so yeah, this is me with my Catholic hat on. Um, because in 553, the second council of Constantinople declared the perpetual virginity of Mary to be an official dogma, and anyone who does not accept it is anathema and a heretic. And on the off chance that the Inquisition, well, okay, now it's the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. Um, Hi, Tuco. Cardinal Fernandez is in charge of it, and his nickname is Tuco. So if he sees this, I'm saying hi. um, but in all seriousness, the the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity is something that emerged starting in the mid second century, with the Proto-Evangelion of James. Is the first document that we have that proposes this interpretation. And it's been something that, has been officially settled doctrine since the 6th century. In practice, people have been disputing it for a long time, and no less of an authority than Thomas Aquinas said that this is something that you just have to take on faith. And for me, what I was talking about earlier about, not having to turn your brain off, for me personally, what makes me not have to turn my brain off is the fact that I'm not being asked to accept some weird scientific explanation about how this happened, right? There's no weird, this is just saying that the birth of Jesus and Mary's perpetual virginity are something that you have to take on faith. As Aquinas said, you know, we accept this because it seems fitting that after Mary's uterus had held God, that it would have been, it would seem weird and inappropriate if it had held a regular human. Well, I mean, that, you know, as a lot, on an emotional level, that kind of makes sense to me. So I'm
Mhm.
willing to say, okay, gonna put the Catholic hat on and accept this as dogma because I'm not being expected to buy into a specific mechanism for how this happened. I just have to believe that somehow it did. Now, dipping back, Catholic hat coming off, because now we're just talking about church history.
Mhm.
Um, Basically, once the perpetual virginity of Mary becomes an idea, which is something that's happening in the second century, this gave Christians a problem. And that problem is that the Gospels talk about Jesus having brothers and sisters, and particularly James. And part of James' authority is the fact that he is Jesus's brother. I should also mention that James is actually mentioned by Flavius Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, um, who in his who in his history mentions the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. So that gives us at least one independent attestation of James's existence. So basically, the two explanations that people have come up with early on was that either these are Jesus's cousins, and it's been theorized that this was either Mary's sister, who was also named Mary, or Mary's sister-in-law, who was also named Mary, who had these kids, and that they were just being referred to as Jesus's siblings because they were just around all the time. The other explanation, and they were, now I should also mention that in this part of the world, like, we know from epigraphic evidence that something like over half of all Jewish women were named Mary. So the idea that you might even have two daughters in a family who were both named Mary, or that you would have Mary and her sister-in-law is also Mary, is possible, right?
Right.
The other and that they were cousins is the official Catholic explanation. The other explanation is that these were Joseph's children from a first marriage, which is the favored explanation of the Orthodox Church. Now, I just want to throw out there one thing that occurs to me that I haven't seen. I'm sure this is not I'm sure I'm not the only person who's thought of this, but I haven't personally seen this in the scholarship at all. and why kind of puzzles me is the possibility that Jesus' siblings were adopted.
Mhm.
And the reason why I think that's worth considering as a possibility is that we know that in this time and this place, it was reasonably common for infants to be exposed. And now we often think of exposure as being like basically a dishonest form of infanticide, right? You leave the baby out somewhere to die and that's it. But um but the truth is that very often unwanted infants were left in like known places, and then kind of anybody who was coming by might scoop up the baby. And I should mention that unfortunately, a lot of these children were raised by people who were interested in enslaving them. So the idea was you pick up a baby, you pay for the baby to be nursed and taught a trade, and then you sell them. Um, and in and in the and in both the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmud, which admittedly are a little bit after the first century, but let's go with it. They both talk about the procedures for basically identifying if a child is Jewish, which is important because that's going to affect the child's future marriage prospects. And although there's not formal adoption, it's considered to be a like basically an extremely praiseworthy act to scoop up a baby and raise them. And the thought that's always occurred to me is like, okay, you're talking about Mary and Joseph walking down the road and they see this like abandoned baby, right? Like, based on at least everything that Catholics believe about the character of Mary and Joseph, I mean, the only question should be which one of them is going to pick up the baby first, right? I mean, yes, this is probably me engaging in a little bit of apologetics, but I think that if you're committed to the perpetual virginity of Mary and that um Jesus had siblings, the possibility that they were adopted, but as Dan McClellan would probably say to me right now, you're just looking for that little sliver of not impossible. And yeah, I kind of am, but it's an explanation that I think doesn't require me to believe anything that's physically impossible.
Exactly. And I would just like to add that, well, of course, in the case of Dan or any other biblical scholar, they are bound to a rigid methodology. But we're not scholars, so we can just delve a little deeper and in a more free way with the sources. And as long as there's some kind of logic, we can just consider it. Of course, it will not be peer reviewed, it will not be published in some scholarly journal, but it's worth considering because you have to be open minded and, check on the sources. That's
Yeah.
what I would say.
Yeah. And again, I think, we need to have room for thinking critically, but not to the extent that's kind of where I am. It's like I want to think critically about things, but at the same time, I think that because of the project that I'm interested in, there also needs to be a little bit of room to, kind of go off on, the mystical tangents, and not to reject supernatural claims simply because they are supernatural.
Exactly.
That's kind of where I land on things, where I'm open to supernatural claims if I don't have to believe anything falsifiable in order for that supernatural claim to be true.
Mhm. Right.
Now, that we've talked about, so what's the issue? And James, of course, is the leader, after the death of Jesus, basically becomes the leader of the Jerusalem community, at least until James is killed, probably around the year 62, if you follow Josephus.
Mhm.
Now, this gets us to the other question, which is the grounds for attributing this gospel to James. Because there is really good evidence to think that James did not write it. The main reason for thinking that James didn't write it is because nobody talks about it until the 300s, or rather the and until the mid 300s. And the first person to talk about it is Origen of Alexandria, or as I prefer to call him, Origen Adamantus, because that sounds like Wolverine is actually secretly a church father. Hey, so Marvel, call me up. I will totally help you come up with that retcon. No, he's not actually Canadian. He's from Alexandria. He's Egyptian, just like Moon Knight. Anyway, so Origen Adamantius is the one who attributes it to James, the brother of the Lord, because the epistle of James actually starts with James, the servant of Christ, which raises the possibility that this was a letter that was written by some dude named James. I should mention at this point that James is the standard English rendering of the Hebrew name Jacob. So it's actually Jacob. And which was and is an extraordinarily popular name among Jewish men. So presumably there would have been a lot of guys running around named Jacob or James or Jacob or however you want to translate it. So it's entirely possible that the letter was written by some guy named James, and then Origen, who likes the letter and wants to give it a little bit of extra authenticity, because Origen is sort of writing at the point where the canon is starting to form. Said, oh, James, it must be James, the brother of Jesus. It's also possible that somebody wrote this pseudographically and attributed it to James. Now, the main reason, other than the date, that scholars tend to land on the side of this wasn't James is the content of the letter is very much responding to sort of concerns that were going on in the third century, and less about what we think we know about the very earliest days of the church. The other reason is that the Greek is really, really good. This is extremely polished Greek, which stands in contrast to something like Mark, where I should mention, I, like Shakespeare, have no Greek. But according to people who I have read and trust who know Greek, if you compare it to, say, the Greek of the book of Mark, where it's obvious that they found somebody who knew how to write real good. James appears to have been composed by someone who was not just a fluent Greek speaker and didn't just know how to make the letters, but who had actually been educated in Greek writing and Greek composition. Which, although it certainly doesn't exclude James, the brother of Jesus, certainly makes him a lot less likely. And certainly Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a church historian who was active in the late third to early fourth century, in his writings also mentions that there is a controversy during his time about whether or not this was written by James, the brother of the Lord. And then later on in the 6th century, St. Jerome, who of course is the translator of the Vulgate, said, just flatly says, I don't think that this is James. Like, I don't think this is James, the brother of the Lord. But everybody is still willing to fall on the side of putting it in the canon anyway, just basically because they really like what it has to say. And therefore, they think that it's useful for instruction, whether or not you think that James actually said this. And part of now, of course, anyone who was raised to believe in sola scriptura is twitching right now. Because if it's not written by James, if it's pseudepigraphal, then that's a problem if you believe in sola scriptura. However, sola scriptura is a formal heresy. And as we have established here at Nerd Church, we are against heresy. And because in the Catholic understanding of Scripture, it's basically Scripture is important because Scripture is given to us by God for instruction. So, and the Catholic understanding is basically that the church created the Bible. So, therefore, what matters is that it made it into the canon. And therefore, we can accept, okay, what it says in the Gospel of James has things that are useful for faith and instruction. It doesn't necessarily matter that, James, the brother of the Lord, as opposed to some other believer named James wrote it. What matters is the content.
Mm.
And I think that if we turn to the content, it's a really useful piece for kind of explaining the attitude that people are supposed to have as they wait and wait and wait for Jesus. And specifically talking about the prophets, which of course ties back nicely to the last section of Isaiah here, where it says, "Those whose the Lords have ransomed will return and enter Zion singing," because of course Isaiah is talking about the end of the Babylonian exile. Yes.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah, which obviously isn't something that everyone who is sent to the exile lived to see. But, they could put faith in this. And then, of course, that's the other thing that has to be dealt with, once again, is the fact that, the second coming did not happen when the people who were compiling the Gospels really thought it was going to happen. And, so this selection of James is sort of hinting towards that, the point is that things are going to happen in the proper time. As a side note, I did go to church today, and the priest was, brought up this problem of, how do we deal with the fact that we're waiting? And he got up, and one of the points that he brought up was basically that, God's time isn't human time. And then he said, for example, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and, written human, and our species has only been around for, I think he said, like 50,000 years. And written human history only dates back about 5,000 years. And I really wish I had had my cell phone camera to record him saying that. So to give to my friends who debunk young Earth creationists, just so it can be like, look, here we have an actual Catholic priest saying there at the pulpit, dressed up in his, pink, in his happy pink dress, that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Of course, and then I remembered that no, the young Earth creationists don't think Catholics are Christian anyway, so it wouldn't help. But so that's basically another sort of interesting negotiation that is going on with the text, that I wanted to sort of highlight there, because it's one of those like really nice bits of it's one of those really nice bits of editing, because it kind of, okay, be patient and wait, kind of gets into your brain almost subliminally. And then that was all I really had to say about James. And then moving on to Matthew, we have already talked about the way that, this is basically saying, hey, remember that passage from Isaiah that talks about the Messiah? Guess what? We've got some fun Messiah stuff. Now, it was kind of particularly interesting to me that the when I opened up my exciting Five Gospels book, that they actually have the part where it's you can't really see it, but Matthew is talking about um, they don't think that the parts that Jesus claiming that he's fulfilling the messianic prophecies is likely to come from Jesus. They think that's a later interpolation. But but they do think that like 7 through 11, where he's talking about the relationship between um, him and John and how he's positioning himself as a successor to John, was something that is probably historical to Jesus, which I thought was kind of interesting because and I kind of turned back to the five gospels just because sometimes I think it's useful to think about like to look at kind of what's the most skeptical reading of this that you can come up with, and to kind of cross check against that against like, okay, is there any there and of course they think now what's particularly interesting about this is that they think that the connection between John the Baptist and Jesus comes from what's usually called the Q gospel. And we've been kind of going on for a while. So I don't want to also drag us down the rabbit hole of the sort of sources and the theories about the relationships between the gospels. So maybe that's something we can hold up for the next time that Q pops up. Mm-hmm. But Q just briefly is the theory that there was another gospel floating around that hasn't survived, that contains material that is in some of the gospels but not in all of the gospels, and that when those shows up that it's drawing on what they like to call Q. And so, but and to me, I think that this relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist is really interesting, if only because it kind of gives us the idea of how like creative and dynamic a religious environment first century Judea and Palestine were at this time. That you had, because I think very often there's a tendency to sort of look at Jesus in a vacuum, right? Jesus is unique, he's unitary, he's singular. When it's like part of the reason why the Jesus movement took off, and part of the reason why people were willing to accept Jesus as the Messiah, was this was a time and a place where everyone was looking for the Messiah. And this was an expected thing. And you have, accounts of many other people, not just Jesus, who were going around working miracles. So, it kind of makes sense. So in that way, Jesus becomes it becomes less unbelievable that Jesus existed as a historical figure and that people were willing to accept him as the Messiah if you understand that this was a series of intense messianic speculation, and that probably a lot of John's followers thought that he was the Messiah. And then John gets arrested. Oops, guess he's not the Messiah. We've got to look around for somebody else. If, of course, you accept the idea that that was something that was happening at the time and not inserted later by people who thought that, who were trying to, after Jesus's crucifixion, were also trying to pick up some of John's followers. And I think that's kind of the last thing that I had to say.
Okay, perfect. So I guess could I just go back a little to what you
Yes,
were
of
saying
course.
about James?
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to touch on this negotiation you were talking about. So you mentioned the proto.
I'm hugely
Mhm,
sorry. I need to pause for like 2 minutes to take a
mhm,
bio break.
sure.
I apologize and thank everyone for their patience. Okay, so you were talking about James?
Yeah. So I wanted to touch on the on this negotiation. So you were telling us about James and how this idea of the of Mary's perpetual virginity appears in the proto gospel to of James, right?
Yeah, it's the Proto-Evangelion of James.
Proto-Evangelion, yeah. So it's interesting that that idea comes from that text, and now it's considered apocryphal. It is not a canonical book, although you can perfectly it is perfectly available for you to read it online or to buy it. And then there's this other idea about the different church fathers who were, church authorities in their time and region, and they would disagree from one another, even in some touching on some points of doctrine, beliefs, and even canon, right? So for was it Jerome you mentioned who
Yeah,
said
Jerome.
he didn't think that the letter of James was actually authored by James.
Yeah.
And then that's something to take into account because proto-Orthodoxy, which would later become Catholicism, was not of one single fabric.
Yeah, yes, and I think that that's something that's very important to highlight is that this idea we have of, Christian unity, um, that there was this sort of original pure church
Mhm.
that then got corrupted just simply is not the case. There's always been argument and disagreement,
Mhm.
and it's kind of from that dynamism that the truth emerges. And that's why, well, I mean, and to kind of pull it into the modern day, when Pope Leo said, no one has a monopoly on the truth, and it's
Mhm.
by this process of study and talking and walking together that we arrive at the truth. I think is very important because one thing that's really obvious about Pope Leo is not only is he a member of the Augustinian order, but I'm pretty sure he is the biggest fanboy that St. Augustine ever had.
Mhm.
And believe me, there is stiff competition, but I've actually considered like setting up a little counter, days since Pope Leo has name checked St. Augustine in an interview.
Mhm.
Like because whenever he gives a speech, he always quotes Augustine. Or when somebody asked him, what books should we read to like understand the way you think about things, he
Mhm.
immediately said, well, except, other than St. Augustine. As though, and we're like, yes, Leo, we get it, we know. Because and I think that that's important because Augustine, in addition to being a great thinker of um and who had a just enormous influence on Christian theology,
Mhm.
but also you know Augustine is still working in a period where the Christian church doesn't have, it is legal, yes, but doesn't really have institutional power. So
Mhm.
everything has to be done by persuasion and coming up with good arguments and being really interested in talking to each other. And like, it's worth mentioning, for example, that Origen, for all that he has a outsized influence on Christian history, is has never been canonized,
Mhm.
because ultimately the some of Origen's views were deemed heretical.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that's sort of an interesting thing to take into account, is that in the same way that in the same way that the early church wasn't afraid of being wrong. Like they yes, they all wanted to be right, they all wanted to get it right, but they were also willing to stake out an opinion and defend it, and then let history, and again, when we're talking about church history, we're talking about maybe not geological time,
Mhm.
but it's like but we're operating on an institutional rather than a human time scale. So you have ideas that will take centuries to develop and will take further centuries before people decide what the orthodox, what is the official version, what's the dogmatic
Mhm.
version. Um, and that's something that I think is always worth keeping in mind and worth focusing on. And I personally am really glad that we've hit the point where heretics get sternly worded emails and response videos, rather than getting set on fire, because
Yeah.
you know it's more fun that way.
And it keeps the conversation alive.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And you never know, like, and some positions that are now recognized and
Mhm.
accepted as dogmas started out as heresies.
Exactly. And I think it's inevitable that to say that times change and the needs of the community and even institutions change. So they have to adapt and reinterpret texts and perhaps change some of the doctrines for the sake of keeping themselves relevant to current society and needs.
Yes, exactly. And also understanding that if ultimately the goal is to get at the truth of scripture, that no one generation is going to have, that no generation has ever had it perfectly right.
Mhm.
I mean, and, so we can and we should definitely be able to talk about the extremely messy process of figuring out right.
Mhm.
So, and I think unless you had anything else to say, I think that's a really great place to end.
I agree, Katie.
Okay. So, once again, like, share, subscribe, do all those lovely and wonderful free things. If you, and otherwise, just, we will see you next week. Same time, same channel for another episode of Nerd Church.